Let me tell you about a piece of ground in southern Idaho that nobody wanted. 22 acres. Poorly drained in the low corners, awkwardly shaped where the ridge cut into it from the north. Hemmed in on the east by a seasonal creek that flooded every third spring and knocked down fence posts like it had a grudge. If you walked it in April, your boots came back muddy. If you walked it in August, the grass was thin and pale where the water had sat too long. It didn't grow the best wheat. It didn't hold the best cattle. It just sat there, on the eastern edge of a 340-acre family farm outside Caldwell, Idaho, being quietly useless. And in the spring of 1987, a man named Marcus Hale died and left it to his youngest son. Now, to understand what happens next, you need to understand a little bit about Marcus. He was not a complicated man. He was a farmer, and he was good at it. And he'd spent 40 years building something solid in Canyon County. The kind of farm that isn't glamorous but never fails. The kind that gets handed down instead of sold off. He was not sentimental in any obvious way. He didn't make speeches. He didn't leave behind journals or wisdom carved into barn beams. When he died, in April, the tulips were just coming up along the fence line, and the family gathered within the week, and the lawyers spread papers across the kitchen table. And the estate was divided with the brisk, practical efficiency that Marcus himself would have approved of. Almost everything went smoothly. One item snagged the process. There was a sealed letter, written in Marcus's slow, deliberate hand. The kind of handwriting that takes its time because it was learned with a fountain pen. It was addressed to his youngest son, Joe. The estate attorney passed it across the table with the mild curiosity of a man who had seen stranger things in wills, but not many. Joe opened it. He read it. He folded it back up. His older brother, a man named Dale, asked what it said. Joe read it aloud. Don't sell the eastern meadow no matter what happens. That was the whole letter, one sentence. The room was quiet for a moment, and then, and this is important, the room was not quiet anymore. Dale pointed out that the eastern meadow carried a tax burden disproportionate to its yield. The estate attorney, to his credit, tried to be neutral, but he did note carefully that the parcel had the lowest assessed value of any piece of ground on the property. A cousin, one of those cousins who shows up at these things and feels entitled to an opinion, said, not with cruelty but with the particular thoughtlessness of someone who thinks they're being kind, that the old man had been sentimental to the end. There was some gentle laughter, the uncomfortable kind, the kind that fills a room when nobody knows what else to do with a dead man's strange instruction. Joe Hale was 31 years old that spring. He was the younger son, which in farming families in southern Idaho in 1987 meant something specific. He'd worked the land his whole life, knew it parcel by parcel, and had less standing at the table than his older brother, who had left for Boise and come back only for holidays and emergencies. Joe wasn't a big talker. He wasn't the kind of man who defended himself loudly. He had his father's handwriting in his hands and his father's sentence in his ears. He folded the letter. He put it in his shirt pocket. He did not explain himself because he had nothing yet to explain. He had only a dead man's single sentence, and a room full of people who thought it was a little funny, and a decision to make about what kind of person he was going to be. He decided. He kept the meadow. Now here's what you need to understand about the 11 years that followed. They were not dramatic. Nobody writes songs about the decade after the funeral when the younger son mows a field nobody wanted. There were no signs. There were no visions. Joe Hale was not mystical about this. He would be the first to tell you that. He didn't walk that ground and feel his father's presence in the grass. He didn't have a theory. He had a letter and a promise. And he kept them the way you keep the unremarkable ones, quietly, without witnesses, without reward. He mowed it in the summer. He paid the taxes in the fall. When the creek rose in the spring of 1989 and took out 60 feet of fence line along the eastern edge, he went out on a cold Saturday morning with a post driver and fixed it. Not because anyone was watching, not because the meadow had earned it, because it was his fence and his ground, and he'd said he'd hold it. The family watched all of this with the patient tolerance people extend to a relative who has a harmless eccentricity. Nobody fought him on it, but nobody understood it either. And when grain prices softened in the early 1990s, and they softened badly, the kind of soft that keeps farmers up at night, the eastern meadow was the first thing that came up at Sunday dinner. Dale had a list. He always had a list. The meadow was at the top of it. And that's when the first offer came in from Boise. But here's the thing about Joe Hale. Here's the thing that nobody in that kitchen could quite get their arms around. He said no. No elaborate speech. No dramatic scene. Just no. Polite. Quiet. Final. The way his father had built fences, one post at a time, set deep, no wobble. The meadow sat. The taxes got paid. The fence got mended. And somewhere on a county road at the western edge of that 22 acres, without anyone quite noticing, a survey crew showed up one afternoon in 1994, took some readings with equipment Joe didn't recognize, and drove away without speaking to a soul. Joe noted it. He said nothing. He kept mowing. But that's not what this story is really about. Not yet. Let me tell you what it actually costs to keep a promise nobody else believes in. Not in dollars. Not yet. In something harder to measure, the slow, grinding friction of being the person in the room who won't move year after year, while everyone around you has perfectly reasonable arguments for why you should. By 1991, Joe Hale had been holding the Eastern Meadow for 4 years. He was 35. He had a wife named Sandra and a daughter named Claire, who had just learned to walk. And the farm was producing well enough. But well enough in Canyon County in the early 90s was a tighter margin than it sounds. Grain prices had not recovered the way everyone had hoped. Input costs were climbing, the kind of arithmetic that farmers do in their heads every morning. The quiet, private calculation of whether the year is going to hold together was coming out a little darker than it had in the late 80s. Dale called from Boise in the fall of that year. He was not unkind about it. That's worth saying. Dale was not a villain. He was an older brother who had left the farm and built a different life, and looked back at the land with the clear, unsentimental eyes of someone who no longer had dirt under his fingernails. He called and he said, "Joe, I've been thinking about the meadow." And Joe said, "I know you have." And Dale said, "There's a land broker out of Boise who's been making quiet inquiries about parcels in Canyon County. Nothing formal, just feelers. And I think if we called him, he'd make an offer worth hearing." Joe was quiet on the phone for a moment. Then he said, "I'm not selling the meadow, Dale." Dale said, "Dad's been gone 4 years." Joe said, "I know how long he's been gone." And that was the end of that conversation. But it was not the end of the pressure, because pressure like that doesn't end. It just goes quiet for a while, and then comes back wearing a different coat. The broker's name was Terry Purcell. He operated out of a small office on Federal Way in Boise, and he had a particular talent for identifying undervalued agricultural parcels in southwest Idaho, the kind of land that looked like nothing until it looked like something, at which point Terry Purcell was usually already standing on it. He made his first formal approach in the spring of 1992. He drove out to the farm on a Tuesday, which told Joe something about him. Serious buyers come on weekdays. And he sat at the same kitchen table where the estate papers had been spread out 5 years earlier. And he put a number on it, $41,000, for 22 acres of poorly drained meadow with a seasonal creek and a tax burden. It was, by any honest measure, a fair offer. The family, those who heard about it, and in a family like this, everyone hears about everything, thought it was more than fair. Sandra didn't say much, but Joe could see her doing the math. $41,000 in 1992 was real money on a working farm carrying debt. It was a tractor. It was 2 years of inputs. It was breathing room. Terry Purcell sat across the table with the relaxed confidence of a man who expected to drive home with a signed agreement. Joe thanked him for the drive and said no. Terry Purcell was professional about it. He left a card. He said, "You change your mind. You call me first. I'll make it worth your while." Joe put the card in the kitchen drawer where dead batteries and expired coupons go to be forgotten. Sandra watched him do it and went back to the dishes without a word. She was that kind of woman. She had married a man who kept his word, and she understood, even when it cost something, that this was not separable from the man she had married. Now here is the part that I want you to sit with for a moment, because this is where most tellings of this kind of story skip ahead to the payoff. And I think that's a mistake. Nothing happened in 1992. Nothing happened in 93 either. Joe mowed the meadow. He paid the taxes, $412 that year. A number he could tell you from memory 20 years later, the way you remember the cost of something you chose to carry. He patched a section of fence in October when a neighbor's cattle drifted through. He stood at the edge of that ground in the early mornings sometimes, not meditating on it, not drawing meaning from it, just looking at it the way a farmer looks at his land, checking it, accounting for it, making sure it was still there and still his. Claire was 4 years old and following him around the farm by then, the way small children do, treating her father's work as the most natural and important thing in the world. She didn't know about the letter. She didn't know about Terry Purcell or Dale's phone calls or the $41,000 her father had turned down. She just knew that on certain mornings her dad drove the tractor out to the east field and made long, slow passes across it. And that when he came back, he smelled like cut grass and diesel. And that was simply part of what the world was. Terry Purcell came back in 1993. Second offer, $47,000. The land market had moved a little, and he moved with it. And he was still reasonable, still professional. And Joe still said no. The Sunday dinner conversation that followed was the sharpest one yet. Dale was there in person that time, home for Thanksgiving. And he didn't exactly argue. Dale knew better than to argue with Joe directly. But he laid out the case the way a careful man lays out a case, piece by piece. And everyone at the table could see the logic of it. And the logic was sound. The meadow was a liability. The farm needed capital. Marcus had been gone 6 years. And his wishes, while worth honoring, had been honored long enough. There was a statute of limitations on deference to the dead. This is what Dale said. Not meanly, just plainly. Joe listened to all of it. He passed the potatoes. He said, I told him I'd hold it, and I'm holding it. Dale said, he can't know that. Joe said, no, but I can. And there it was, the whole thing, in 6 words. Not mysticism, not stubbornness exactly. Something more fundamental. A man's private accounting of who he was, kept separate from whether anyone was watching or whether it would ever pay off. The meal finished. The dishes were done. Dale drove back to Boise. The meadow sat in the dark, 22 acres of thin grass and soft ground, and fence posts set deep, and it did not know or care what had just been decided on its behalf. Then came 1994, and the survey crew. Joe had noticed them the first time. He'd mentioned it once to Sandra. In the offhand way you mention something you can't quite account for. 2 men, a white truck with a state agency seal he didn't stop to read, equipment he didn't recognize. Working along the western edge of the county road for the better part of an afternoon. They didn't knock. They didn't explain themselves. They took their readings and they left. In farming country, survey crews mean something. They mean someone is thinking about something. Joe filed it away in the back of his mind the way a careful man files things. Not acted on, not forgotten. He kept mowing. He kept paying the taxes. $438 in 94. $451 in 95. He could tell you every year's figure. Some men remember their children's shoe sizes through the years, the small measurements of a life moving forward. Joe Hale remembered tax receipts on a field nobody thought he should own. Sandra asked him once, in the quiet of a Tuesday evening in the winter of 95, whether he ever doubted it. Not combatively, just genuinely. She was sitting across from him at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and Claire was asleep down the hall. And it was the kind of night when you can ask your husband the real question. He thought about it for a long time. Then he said, I doubt it the same way I doubt anything I can't prove yet. But I made him a promise. And either I'm the kind of person who keeps it, or I'm not. I'd rather be wrong about the meadow than wrong about that. She nodded. She drank her coffee. Outside, the eastern meadow sat dark and frozen under a Canyon County winter. All 22 acres of it. The soft corners, the seasonal creek, the fence line mended 3 times over, waiting for something that might never come. And then, in 1996, a document landed on a desk at the Idaho Transportation Department, and the world quietly rearranged itself. And that's when everything changed. Let me tell you about the moment when 9 years of silence finally speak. It doesn't arrive the way you expect it to. There's no trumpet. There's no phone call in the middle of the night with someone breathless on the other end. It arrives the way most important things arrive in ordinary lives, as a document. Dense, bureaucratic, printed on government paper, written in the particular language of people who spend their careers describing land in terms of grade percentages and drainage coefficients and corridor alignments. The kind of document that sits in a stack of mail for 2 days before anyone opens it. Because the envelope looks like every other envelope from a state agency, and state agencies send a lot of envelopes to farms in Canyon County. Joe Hale opened it on a Thursday morning in the spring of 1996, standing at the kitchen counter with his coffee still hot. It was a corridor study, 53 pages, plus appendices. Issued by the Idaho Transportation Department, commissioned by the Federal Highway Administration, concerning a proposed connector route between 2 interstate exchanges east and west of Caldwell. The project had been in preliminary discussion for years. Joe had heard vague mention of it at the feed store, the way you hear vague mention of everything in a small county, as rumor and speculation that never quite hardens into fact. Now it had hardened. He sat down at the kitchen table. He read it slowly, all 53 pages. Now here's what you need to understand about that document and what it said. The engineers had modeled 7 possible alignments for this connector route. 7 different paths the highway could theoretically take across the landscape between those 2 interchanges. And one by one, 6 of them had been ruled out. One alignment ran into a basalt shelf that made the grading costs prohibitive. 2 others crossed federally designated wetlands that couldn't be touched without triggering a review process that would add years and millions to the timeline. One cut directly through an established industrial park on the west side of Caldwell. Another required the demolition of infrastructure that the county had just spent 9 years building. 6 alignments, 6 closed doors. The 7th alignment ran in a clean, grade-favorable line across the eastern edge of Caldwell, through the only natural gap in the ridge for 11 miles in either direction, north or south. A gap created by geology over 10,000 years, by the way a particular fold in the earth happened to settle, by the path a seasonal creek had cut across centuries. A gap that sat, with the precision of something arranged rather than accidental, directly across a 22-acre meadow outside Caldwell, Idaho. Joe set the document down on the kitchen table. He sat with it for a while. Then he picked up the phone and called Dale. Now I want to tell you about that phone call, because it matters. Joe didn't gloat. That's the first thing to understand. He wasn't built for it, and even if he had been, this wasn't the moment for it. He called his brother and he said, "Dale, I need you to come out here. I've got something you should read." And Dale, who knew his brother well enough to hear something different in his voice, said he'd be there Saturday. Saturday came. Dale sat at the kitchen table with the corridor study in front of him. He read the relevant section twice. He looked up at Joe, who was standing at the counter with his arms folded, not triumphant, just still. The way a man is still when he has been waiting a long time for something, and it has finally arrived and he's not quite sure yet what to do with it. Dale said, "How did he know?" Joe said, "I don't know that he did." Dale said, "Then how did you know?" Joe said, "I didn't. I just held it." Dale nodded. He looked back down at the document. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I owe you an apology." Joe said, "No, you don't. You were being practical. That's not a sin." And that was all they said about it. 2 brothers, a kitchen table, a government document, and 9 years of Thanksgiving dinners where one of them had been patiently, quietly, stubbornly right. They didn't need to make a speech about it. They were Idaho farmers. They folded it up and moved forward. What came next was not fast. People imagine these things as fast. The revelation comes. The money follows. Done. But government processes are not fast. And federal highway projects are especially not fast. And what actually happened over the following 18 months was a long, careful, sometimes frustrating negotiation between Joe Hale and the Idaho Transportation Department, mediated by a right-of-way attorney out of Nampa named Ruth Eller, who was 62 years old, had done this kind of work for 30 years, and told Joe in their first meeting that he was in a stronger position than he realized. She was right. The department needed that corridor. Not a corridor like it. That corridor. The geology had closed every other door. Joe wasn't being unreasonable or obstructionist. He was simply a man who owned something that the state of Idaho needed, and he had a right-of-way attorney who understood the difference between a negotiation and a surrender. The federal appraisal came in stages, the way these things do. The first figure the department floated was not the final figure. Ruth Eller looked at it, set it down on her desk, and told Joe they could do better. They did better. Then they did better again. The process took until the spring of 1997, a full year of letters and meetings and revised figures, and one afternoon where it looked like the department might pursue a condemnation proceeding, which Ruth Eller described to Joe in the calmest possible terms as a chess move, not a threat, and which she countered the following week in a way that ended that particular line of thinking. The final figure was $4 million. $4 million for the right-of-way across that 22-acre meadow. The permanent easement, the construction access, the full settlement. Not for the whole parcel. Joe kept the land. He just gave them the corridor through it, and they paid him $4 million for the right to use it. Let me put that in terms that land in that ground in Canyon County in 1997. Terry Purcell had offered $41,000 for the whole parcel in 1992. The assessed value of the meadow at the time of Marcus's death had been somewhere around $35,000. The tax burden that Dale had cited at the estate table, the reason this piece of ground wasn't worth keeping, had amounted to, over the 10 years Joe held it, roughly $4,200 in total. Joe had paid $4,200 over a decade to hold an asset that settled for $4 million. The Idaho Statesman ran a brief item about the right-of-way settlement. It didn't use Joe's name. These things are matters of public record but not front-page news. But Terry Purcell read it anyway, because Terry Purcell read everything in that paper that concerned Canyon County land. He read the figure. He set the paper down. He looked out his office window on Federal Way for a long time. Joe did not speak to the press. He had nothing to say to the press. He deposited the check, and he called Ruth Eller and thanked her, and he paid off the remaining debt on the farm in full. Every note, every line of credit, every obligation. And when it was done, he sat at the kitchen table on a quiet evening in the fall of 1997, and the farm was his, clean and free, for the first time in its history. Sandra put a cup of coffee in front of him. He looked at it for a moment. He said, "Dad knew that ground was worth something." She said, "Do you think he knew about the highway?" Joe was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I think he knew the ground. I think he'd walked every acre of this farm for 40 years. And he knew that gap in the ridge was the only one for miles. Whether he knew what that would mean one day." He stopped. He shook his head slowly. "I don't think it matters whether he knew," he said. "He knew enough to ask me to hold it. That was all he needed to know." She sat across from him. Outside, in the dark, the eastern meadow was already being surveyed for the construction that would begin the following spring. Stake flags in the ground, orange spray paint on the grass, the beginning of the end of its long, quiet uselessness. But here is what I need you to understand before we get to the end of this story. The $4 million is not the point. It never was. And that's not what this story is really about. Let me tell you about what remains after the money is gone, and the concrete is poured. And the world has moved on to the next thing. By the summer of 2001, the connector route was open. It carried about 12,000 vehicles a day in its first year. Commuters, freight trucks, the ordinary commerce of a region that needed a faster way between 2 points. The kind of infrastructure that becomes invisible the moment it opens, because that is what good infrastructure does. People drove over it on their way to work, on their way to pick up their kids, on their way to somewhere else entirely, and they did not think about the ground beneath them, or the man who had mowed it for 11 years, or the letter that had started the whole thing. At the meadow's eastern corner, where the creek bent north, there was now a concrete bridge abutment. Gray, solid, unremarkable. The kind of thing that will outlast everyone involved in this story by 100 years. The seasonal creek still ran beneath it every spring, still spread into the low corners of the remaining ground, still knocked things loose if the winter had been wet enough. The meadow itself, what was left of it on either side of the right-of-way, still grew thin pale grass in the soft spots and better grass on the high ground. It was still not the farm's productive heart. It was still awkward and marginal, and a little hard to get equipment into. Joe still mowed it. Some things don't change just because the reason for them has been vindicated. He had framed his father's letter. Not in the front room, not above the fireplace where visitors would ask about it, and he'd have to tell the story to people he barely knew. He'd put it in the back room of the farmhouse, the room where the equipment manuals were kept, and the spare parts inventory, and the shelf of seed catalogs going back 15 years that Sandra kept threatening to throw away, and never did. A working room. A room for things that were useful and necessary, and not for show. The letter hung there in a simple dark frame, between a hydraulic diagram for the old baler and a county soil map from 1979. If you didn't know to look for it, you'd miss it entirely. Don't sell the eastern meadow, no matter what happens. One sentence. In a dead man's slow, deliberate hand. Claire was 16 in 2001. She had grown up in the orbit of this story without ever quite being told it directly. She knew the broad shape of it, the way children know the broad shape of things that happened before they were old enough to understand them. She knew her grandfather had left her father a letter. She knew the letter had said something about the meadow. She knew the meadow had become part of a highway, and that this had turned out well financially, and that her father didn't talk about it much, which was how he handled most things that mattered to him deeply. But that summer she asked him. They were in the back room together, Claire looking for a manual for the irrigation pump, Joe going through the parts shelf with the focused patience of a man who knows exactly what he's looking for and won't be rushed. She found the letter on the wall. She read it. She'd seen it before, but this time she stood in front of it for a while, the way you stand in front of something when you're old enough to start asking the real questions. She said, "Dad, what would you have done if the highway never came?" Joe didn't answer right away. He found the part he was looking for on the shelf, held it up to the light, turned it over in his hands, set it down. He said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I mean, what if it had just been a field? What if Grandpa's letter had turned out to mean nothing? Practically speaking." Joe was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man who doesn't have an answer. The quiet of a man who wants to get the answer right. Then he said, "Your grandfather knew something. Or he felt something. Or maybe, and I've thought about this a lot over the years, maybe he just loved that ground for reasons he couldn't put into a sentence. He'd walked it for 40 years. He knew the gap in that ridge. He knew the creek. Maybe he had a reason and maybe he didn't. I'll never know." Claire waited. Joe said, "But here's the thing. He asked me for one thing in his whole life, written down in a letter, sealed up, handed to a lawyer to give me after he was gone. And the room laughed at it. You understand? The room full of people who loved him. They thought it was a little funny. Sentimental old man, leaving instructions about a useless field." He picked up the part from the shelf again, turned it in his hands. He said, "The only question I had to answer was whether I was the kind of person who keeps a promise to a dead man when everyone in the room is laughing. That's all it ever was. The highway made it look like wisdom. But for 9 years before that highway, it just looked like stubbornness. And I had to decide every single year, when the tax bill came, when Dale called, when Terry Purcell drove out from Boise and sat at our kitchen table with a reasonable number, I had to decide whether the laughing room got to determine who I was." Claire looked at the letter on the wall. She said, "And it didn't." Joe said, "No, it didn't. Now here is what I want you to hold on to as we come to the end of this story, because this is the part that matters, and I don't want it to get lost in the arithmetic. $4 million is a life-changing sum. The retirement of debt on a working farm, every note cleared, every obligation met, is not a small thing. Joe Hale was not indifferent to it. He did not pretend the money didn't matter. He was a farmer, and farmers understand the weight of a paid-off note the way other people understand almost nothing else. Because for a farmer, the land and the debt against it are a single knot. And when the knot releases, you can breathe in a way you couldn't before. He breathed. He was grateful. He did not waste it. But the money was a consequence. It was not the story. The story was a Tuesday in October of 1989, with a post driver and 60 feet of fence line and no one watching. The story was $4,200 in tax receipts, paid year by year, for ground that might never have been worth a cent more than Terry Purcell's $41,000. The story was Sandra at the kitchen table in the winter of '95, asking the real question, and Joe giving her the only honest answer he had. Not "I know it will pay off, but I'd rather be wrong about the meadow than wrong about that." The story was Dale sitting at the kitchen table with the corridor study in front of him, reading the same sentence twice, and looking up at his brother and saying, "How did he know?" And Joe saying, "I don't know that he did." Because that was the truth. Marcus Hale may have known something, or felt something, or loved a piece of ground for reasons that couldn't be put into a sentence. Or he may have simply been a man who wanted one thing honored after he was gone, and trusted one son to honor it, and gotten lucky. Joe would never know which, and somewhere along the way, somewhere in the middle of the 11 years of mowing, the taxes paid, the 2 offers declined, the letter carried in a shirt pocket. Joe had made his peace with never knowing, because it didn't change the answer. The answer was always the same. It was yes or no. Either you are the kind of person who keeps a promise to a dead man when everyone in the room is laughing, or you are not. Either you hold the ground, or you don't. The highway was not a reward for virtue. The highway was geology, a fold in the earth, a gap in a ridge, a creek that cut its path 10,000 years before Marcus Hale was born. It could just as easily have never been needed. The promise would still have been worth keeping. This is what Joe said to Claire that summer in the back room, standing between a hydraulic diagram and a county soil map, holding a small metal part in his hand. And then he went back to work. The letter stayed on the wall. Outside, 12,000 cars a day crossed the concrete bridge abutment at the eastern corner of the meadow, moving between 2 points, not thinking about the ground beneath them, not thinking about the 11 years of mowing, or the taxes, or the man who said no to a reasonable offer twice because he had folded a letter into his shirt pocket at a kitchen table in the spring of 1987 and decided, in that quiet and unremarkable way that determines everything about a person, who he was going to be. The seasonal creek still ran beneath the bridge every spring. The thin grass still grew pale in the low corners where the water sat too long. And on the wall in the back room of the farmhouse, between the hydraulic diagram and the soil map, in a dead man's slow, deliberate hand, one sentence, not framed prominently, not for show, just there, useful, necessary, the way a promise is.